This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that used to tolerate neutral, and now it punishes it. You were trained to believe there's a safe lane between rival powers, a middle path, a space where trade stays trade and security stays security. But that lane is collapsing, quietly, in plain sight, not with a declaration, with leverage, with ports, with paperwork, with a single decision that looks routine until you realize it changes who gets to move through the world and who gets strangled for trying. And here's the part people miss. When the system stops allowing neutrality, it doesn't just pick winners. It forces countries and eventually ordinary people into consequences they didn't vote for. If you want the next part of this breakdown, subscribe now, because what comes next is the mechanism, and it's already in motion. Hold that thought, because the first signal wasn't a speech, it was a presence. You were told power lives in elections, in leaders, in speeches. That is no longer true. What controls the system now is not who wins, but who can impose cost fastest. Not armies, not ideology, access, choke points, markets, insurance, shipping lanes, legal forums, trade rules that look technical until they aren't. The system has reorganized itself around pressure, not persuasion. It rewards alignment and punishes ambiguity, quietly, efficiently, without ever declaring a side. This is why personalities no longer matter. Not because leaders are irrelevant, but because the machinery runs past them. The decision is binary before the debate even begins. Participate or pay. Signal loyalty or absorb damage. And once that framework locks in, neutrality becomes visible. And visibility becomes vulnerability. That's the shift most people haven't clocked yet. The danger isn't confrontation. It's compliance disguised as normal procedure. A system that doesn't shout, it invoices. And here's the trap. The more a country insists it's independent, the more the system tests that claim. Which brings us to the change that made all of this possible. The change that happened slowly enough for almost everyone to miss it. Before this shift, pressure was episodic. A crisis, a sanction, a war, something loud enough to name. Now it's ambient. There was a time when alignment was explicit. You signed a treaty, you hosted a base, you voted a certain way, and consequences followed openly, predictably. You could see the line you were crossing. That's no longer how the system works. What changed quietly is that enforcement detached from declarations. It moved into routine processes, port access, insurance underwriting, trade preferences, legal venues, technical reviews that look administrative until they cascade. Before a country could drift, hedge, delay decisions, balance relationships, that space mattered. It bought time. Now, time itself has been weaponized. The slow normalization of pressure is the most dangerous part, because nothing feels like a crisis until everything is already constrained. By the time leaders notice, options have narrowed. By the time citizens feel it, explanations sound abstract, procedural, inevitable. This is how systems harden without announcing themselves. And once that hardening occurs, symbolic acts stop being symbolic, they become tests, signals the system responds to automatically, which is why the next moment matters. Because the first visible shock wasn't theoretical, it was concrete. And it landed where neutrality thought it was still protected. The shock didn't arrive as an ultimatum. It arrived as something that looked ordinary. A scheduled exercise, a docking request, a line item on a calendar that read like cooperation, not confrontation. But in a hardened system, nothing routine is neutral anymore. The moment that decision was logged, approved, stamped, normalized, the machinery responded. Not emotionally, automatically. Markets recalibrated risk. Partners recalculated exposure. Observers stopped asking why and started asking what this signals. That's how mini crises work now. They don't explode, they register. What mattered wasn't the exercise itself. It was where it happened, when it happened, and who was watching. Because in this system, proximity is interpretation. Presence is alignment. Silence is read as consent. Officials tried to frame it as safety, as cooperation, as continuity. Language designed to slow the reaction. It didn't. The response didn't come as a statement. It came as attention, intense, unblinking, the kind that precedes cost. If this feels distant, pause here and stay with me, because this is the point where ordinary decisions begin producing extraordinary consequences. And the reason isn't ideology, it's mechanism. Because once the system marks a signal, it doesn't argue with it. It processes it. And what that processing looks like, who absorbs it, who benefits from it, is the part almost no one sees until it's too late. What the system does next is invisible by design. There is no meeting where consequences are voted on, no announcement that says this is punishment. The mechanism works because it doesn't need intent once the signal is read. First, risk is reassessed quietly. Insurance premiums shift. Financing terms tighten. Deals that used to clear automatically begin to require review. Nothing is denied outright. It's delayed, deferred, made expensive. Then leverage redistributes. Actors with alternatives gain flexibility. Actors without them absorb friction. The cost doesn't land on the people who made the symbolic choice. It lands downstream on exporters, on workers, on supply chains that were built for a world that assumed access was stable. This is who benefits. Systems that can reroute capital, markets that can substitute partners, powers that can impose cost without acknowledging it. This is who pays. Economies that depend on predictability, populations that don't get a vote on signaling. And here's the cruel efficiency of it. The mechanism doesn't reverse easily. Once confidence erodes, it doesn't snap back. Even if rhetoric softens, even if officials reassure, the system remembers risk longer than it remembers promises, which is why the next escalation mattered so much. Because the first signal invited scrutiny, the second one accelerated consequence, and when the pace increases, explanation becomes a liability. The second shock moved faster, shorter timelines, less patience, no space for careful messaging. What had been procedural friction turned into compression. Decisions stacked, windows closed, warnings arrived late, if they arrived at all. The system wasn't escalating emotionally. It was accelerating mechanically. Signals multiplied, each one small on its own. Together, irreversible. Access narrowed. Tolerance thinned. Assumptions expired. This is where most analysts get it wrong. They look for a dramatic break, a sanction, a rupture you can point to. That's not how this phase works. The damage comes from velocity, from the speed at which optionality disappears. And once acceleration begins, correction becomes nearly impossible. Because slowing down requires consensus, but speeding up only requires inertia. The system favors momentum. By the time leaders realize the pressure isn't symbolic anymore, the costs are already embedded, contracts written differently, risk models updated, future decisions quietly pre-decided. And here's the part that should unsettle you. Acceleration doesn't care if the original choice was justified. It only cares that the signal was sent. Which means the next impact isn't abstract. It isn't diplomatic. It isn't theoretical. It lands where people live, and this is where the system finally reaches you. Not as a headline, not as a debate, as absence. The job that doesn't reopen, the contract that quietly moves elsewhere. The price that rises without explanation. The delay that becomes permanent. You're told it's global conditions, market forces, necessary adjustments, language that smooths over the truth. Decisions made far away are now shaping your margin for error. And here's the cruel part. You didn't signal anything. You didn't dock a ship. You didn't choose a side. But the system doesn't distribute consequences by responsibility. It distributes them by exposure. If your work depends on access, you feel it first. If your community depends on stability, you absorb it longest. If your government insists it's still neutral, you're asked to pay for that claim. This is how geopolitical choices become personal without ever being explained that way. So stay with me, share this, subscribe. Because if this pressure is already showing up in daily life, the next phase won't be framed as foreign policy at all. It will be framed as inevitability. And that's dangerous, because what's spreading next doesn't stop at borders. What's happening now doesn't stay contained. Systems like this never do. Pressure that begins in one corridor migrates. Shipping routes reroute. Insurance regimes update globally. Trade partners watch, learn, and pre-adjust. What looks like a local recalibration becomes a template. This is how spillover works in a hardened system. No announcement, just imitation. Other states take notes, not on ideology, but on cost. They watch which signals trigger friction, which gestures invite scrutiny, which claims of independence are tolerated and which are punished, and they adjust their own behavior quietly in advance. That's the ripple most people miss. Not escalation, but anticipation. Once enough actors internalize the lesson, the system tightens everywhere. Fewer gray zones, less room to hedge, more preemptive alignment. The map redraws itself without a summit or a treaty. And here's the unsettling part. Global systems don't require consensus to change direction. They only require enough participants to stop believing neutrality is safe. At that point, uncertainty becomes structural. Decisions are made defensively. Innovation slows. Risk avoidance replaces ambition. And the world feels smaller, more brittle, less forgiving, which leaves us here at the edge of what comes next. Because once ripple turns into pattern, the future stops being hypothetical. From here, the system doesn't move in a straight line. It branches. There are 3 paths in front of it now, none of them clean, none of them stable. The first is adjustment, quiet recalibration, softening signals, technical compromises that allow access to reopen without anyone admitting retreat. This path preserves surface stability, but only by narrowing autonomy. Choices still exist. They're just made earlier. And offstage, the second is erosion. Friction becomes normal. Costs accumulate slowly enough to endure, but not to ignore. Growth thins. Opportunity concentrates elsewhere. The system doesn't collapse, it hollows. And people adapt to less without ever being told that's what's happening. The third is rupture. A misread signal. A hardened response, a moment where economic pressure and security signaling collide instead of sequencing. This path isn't chosen, it's triggered. And once triggered, reversal isn't procedural, it's political. Here's the danger. All 3 paths can look identical at the start. Early adjustment resembles erosion. Early erosion hides rupture risk. And by the time the distinction matters, momentum has already chosen for you. That's why the next phase isn't about prediction, it's about recognition. Because the system has already stopped asking what's fair, it's asking what's enforceable. And that question doesn't wait. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to reassure you, to promise balance will return, that the system will correct, that reason will reassert itself. It won't. Systems don't self-correct when pressure works. They refine it. What you're watching isn't a dispute over policy or alliances. It's a rehearsal, a demonstration of what happens when neutrality is tested in a world that no longer has patience for it. The lesson isn't delivered with tanks or speeches. It's delivered with access and the withdrawal of it. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't need to be repeated loudly. Others absorb it preemptively, quietly. They adjust before they're forced to. That's how enforcement scales. So don't mistake the absence of explosions for the absence of danger. The warning isn't that conflict is coming. It's that constraint is already here and expanding. If you're trying to understand where this leads, don't look for the next headline. Look for the next routine decision that suddenly carries weight it never used to. That's where the system is speaking now. Stay with this. subscribe, because the next breakdown won't be about one country or one choice. It will be about how many spaces like this are left and what happens when there are none. And once you see that, you can't unsee it.